I grew up in the middle of nowhere. A lot of people say that about their one-horse town, but truly, my earliest memories are of endless fields of wheat stretching to the horizon, where the land seemed to dissolve into the sky. I'll spare the details of exactly where the house was, but we were in Kansas. The nearest town with a grocery store was 40 miles away. We were completely isolated. I wish I could say it was boring, but something about that place always felt wrong. My mom married my stepfather when I was 3 years old. We moved from St. Louis to his farmstead, the one out in the middle of nowhere. The house itself looked ordinary. If you saw it on a suburban street, you'd think nothing of it. But here, it felt misplaced, like it had been dropped there by mistake. The yard was perfectly kept, a bright square of green grass. Beyond the fence was nothing but dead land, dying weeds, and brittle wheat that rattled in the wind. The house was painted white, not the soft white of old farmhouses, but a bright, blinding white that reflected the sun so harshly it hurt to look at in the summer. Sometimes I would squint at it and feel like I was staring at a lighthouse in the middle of an empty sea. And then there was the rainbow. Summer storms rolled through often. The clouds would darken the sky, and the wind would whip across the fields. But the rain never seemed to fall hard enough to help anything grow. Everything out there stayed dead. Always dead. When the clouds began to break apart, a rainbow would appear. My younger stepsister loved rainbows. Unicorns too. All the things little girls are supposed to adore. She would clap and point and run outside to see it. But something about that rainbow always made me uneasy. We watch The Wizard of Oz every year. Most people in Kansas take pride in that movie. At least I think. I remember the first time we watched it. During a storm on our old box television set. Seeing the tornado rip through the farm and lift Dorothy's house into the sky in bright Technicolor. Everyone else loved that movie. It deeply disturbed me. Watching that house spin away made me think of our own home, about the fact that we lived right in the middle of tornado country. We didn't have a storm cellar, nothing underground to hide in. I used to lie awake during storms and wonder what would stop our house from being picked up and thrown somewhere else. Sometimes I wondered something worse. What if it already had been? What if the house had been blown away long ago, and this was simply where it landed? After storms passed, my sister and I would wander outside and stare up at the rainbow. It always sat in the sky, at the same strange angle. One end disappeared behind a distant hill, just beyond the cresting wheat fields. We never walked very far. Not because we were afraid of getting lost. The house shone so brightly you could see it from anywhere. It was more that there was nothing out there worth finding. Still, the rainbow must end somewhere. I decided I was going to find out where. The song from The Wizard of Oz had been stuck in my head for days. Somewhere over the rainbow. The idea finally took hold in my mind all at once, and without hesitation. Follow the rainbow and find its end. I packed a crude bindle with snacks and a few tools, a compass and a small pair of binoculars. In truth, I was more interested in pretending to be a wanderer than preparing for anything serious. My stepsister was around 4 at the time. She begged to come with me, but I promised her I would come back as soon as I discovered what was waiting at the end of the rainbow. If you're wondering where my parents were, my stepfather was seldom seen. He might have lived in the house, but I rarely saw him. Sometimes he would simply appear in a doorway or a hallway, as if he'd been standing there all along. My mom spent most of her time sleeping. Later I would understand that she wasn't just tired. She had her own demons she was trying to escape. But at the time, it simply meant I had free reign. Nobody noticed where I went or how long I was gone. As a kid, I never stopped to think about how dangerous that might be. I set off after the storm had passed. The rainbow was still faint, slowly brightening as the clouds drifted apart. That gave me time to follow it. It stretched out toward darker clouds gathering along the horizon, and somewhere beyond those clouds, I knew the rainbow ended. I began walking through the fields of wheat, the brittle stalks snapping and crunching under my sneakers with each step. Occasionally, a cicada would burst from the ground and leap away, the sudden whir of its wings making me flinch. I expected the end of the rainbow to come into view after the first hill I crested. The hills weren't very large. That area in Kansas doesn't really have hills, so much as gentle rises in the land, small bumps in an otherwise endless plain. But when I reached the top and looked out, the rainbow was still there in the distance, stretching farther ahead, as if it had moved while I walked. I crested another hill, and another. Each time the same thing happened. The rainbow slid farther away, still leaning against the dark line of clouds on the horizon. It almost looked as if it were growing. I walked for a long time. Eventually the sun broke through the thinning clouds and came down hard, the kind of blistering summer heat that makes the air shimmer above the ground. I stopped to take a break. I drank some water and pulled out a peanut butter and jelly sandwich I had wrapped in wax paper. I sat on a lone rock in the middle of the field. There weren't many hills out there, but from where I sat, I noticed something strange about the land around me. The ground rolled gently in every direction. The small rises formed a circle around me. I was sitting in a valley. That was when I saw something in the corner of my eye. I know how this is going to sound. At first, I thought it was a deer. It was moving slowly down the side of one of the hills, toward the end of the rainbow. But something about it immediately felt wrong. For one thing, it didn't quite look like a deer. It looked like something wearing fur. Wearing. That was the only word that fit. The shape of it was wrong. Its body stood too upright. For a second, it almost looked like a person, except taller, much taller, and all wrong. I only caught a glimpse of it before it passed over the hill and disappeared. I told myself it had to be some kind of animal. My brain kept trying to correct what I had seen, to turn it into something normal. But that feeling wouldn't go away. And as I watched the hill where it had vanished, I noticed something else. The rainbow had stretched farther again. And beyond it, the clouds looked darker than they had before. The next hill I crested revealed something strange. The rolling landscape had given way to a vast open field. So wide, I could see distant rain falling in a gray sheet. The clouds were jet black over the next embankment, likely at least a couple miles away. I thought about turning back then, but something made me hesitate. The rainbow, which by all rights should have faded into nothing by now, continued on. And over that last hill, deep down, I knew the end of it was there. But the clouds above it were vicious. I saw the first faint hints of funnels beginning to form. Tornadoes. It sounds crazy, I know, but I had already come this far, and I knew that if I turned back and tried again another day, I might just run into the same thing again. So I kept walking, then began to walk faster, trying to reach the end of the rainbow before it vanished, before it would be swallowed by something darker. As I walked through the field, I kept watching for the strange creature I had seen earlier. I had no idea where it could have gone. I had started walking only a few minutes after it had crested the hill, yet now I stood in a massive open field, and there was no sign of it anywhere. More than once I checked over my shoulder, half expecting to find it hunched over, stalking me. But it wasn't there. It wasn't anywhere. The clouds above were beginning to churn, thunder rumbling somewhere deep inside them, as if warning me not to come any closer. The rainbow remained. But to my horror, I noticed it was fading. I began to run. I was nearly there, Just one more hill to crest. If the rainbow somehow stretched beyond that, I would know this was a lost cause, and it would be time to turn around. But something inside me kept screaming, "It's here, it's here." That thought alone pushed me forward through burning calves and a dry, aching throat. I was already exhausted by the time I began climbing the hill. At one point, I was just staring down at my shoes as they crushed the wheat beneath me. When I finally looked up to see how much farther I had to go, I saw the creature again. A wave of nausea rolled through me. It was the being at the end of the rainbow. It wasn't anything whimsical like the Wizard of Oz. I never saw its face. It had its back to me. But some things were unmistakably true. Its arms were long, stretching almost to its knees. Its fur was matted and uneven. It stood upright on legs that looked like a deer's, long and jointed wrong, too tall for the rest of its body. It never looked at me, but I saw one of its ears twitch, as if it sensed something behind it. Then it bolted. The way it ran was uncanny, not like an animal, not like a deer. It moved like a tall, gangly human who had never quite learned how to run properly. I stopped where I was. For a moment, I wasn't sure I could keep going. My heart was hammering in my chest, and now I knew the end of the rainbow was not meant for my eyes, but it was right there. For a long time I stood there, watching the rainbow fade more and more with each passing second. I had to know. I had to know what was there. So I crested the hill, following in the creature's wake. I reached the top of the hill and looked down. There it was. The rainbow faded straight into the earth, barely visible, through the rain that had begun to fall the moment I reached the summit. The storm had arrived in a full fury. Sheets of rain swept across the fields, bending the wheat flat in the wind. It was dark. At first, it looked like nothing more than another stretch of farmland. Then I saw them. Vents. They dotted the valley floor like tiny volcanoes. At first, I thought there were dozens scattered across the field. Then lightning cracked across the sky and illuminated the valley. There were hundreds, maybe more. The creature was nowhere to be seen, but I knew deep down where it had gone, and many others like it must have lived inside those vents. I knew then that the true Oz lay beneath my feet, hidden somewhere in the subterranean labyrinth those things called home. But I wouldn't go any closer. The storm above was becoming savage now. I could see the shape of the funnel from earlier beginning to descend in the distance. A tornado pushing its way toward the ground. It looked far away, but those things can be deceiving. Distance in a valley like that can play tricks on you. And then a terrible thought struck me. The only place I could take cover, if the storm reached me, would be inside one of those vents. I would have to climb down into whatever waited below, into that hellish Oz, with them. Another bolt of lightning tore across the sky, and in the darkness of those holes, I saw them. The faintest glimmers of blue. Eyes, glowing from deep within the vents, staring outward into the storm. I ran toward the homestead. The rainbow was gone now. The wind pushed hard at my back, as if trying to shove me forward. For a long time, I didn't dare look behind me. I was certain a tornado was forming somewhere in the storm. The wind screamed in my ears. Rain stung my face, then turned to hail. The rain was hammering down now. I began to wonder if I'd lost my direction. My legs burned, and eventually they simply gave out beneath me. I fell hard into the wheat. When I tried to stand, they wouldn't work. My breathing turned frantic. I began hyperventilating, panic rising in my chest. My hands curled into claws, and a tingling numbness spread across my cheeks. For a moment, I thought I might die and become one of those things. I forced myself forward anyway. At first I walked, fast and clumsy, then slowly broke back into a run. And then I crested a hill. There was the homestead. It shone like a beacon in the distance. A strange beam of sunlight had broken through the clouds and fell directly on the house, while the sky around it remained black with storm. I ran for it. By the time I reached the yard, the storm had overtaken everything. Rain and hail battered the roof and windows. I burst through the door, expecting my mother to be there, furious and worried. I expected my stepfather to be waiting too, staring at me in that cold, cruel way of his. But neither of them were there. The house was dark. The power had gone out. I ran to my room and climbed into bed, pulling the comforter over my head. I lay there for a long time. The smell of rain clung to my clothes, sharp and acidic, and my own breath made the space beneath the blanket hot and suffocating. But I was afraid to look outside again. Then I heard a voice. A whisper. It was my stepsister. She asked if I had found it, if I had found what was waiting at the end of the rainbow. I slowly pulled the comforter down. She was standing in the darkness at the foot of my bed. She asked again, what was it? I planned to tell her there was nothing there. No pot of gold, no unicorn, that the rainbow had simply faded away before I ever reached the end. But then I looked at her eyes. They shone ever so slightly blue in the darkness. And I realized something. She already knew the answer. We had been driving for nearly 8 hours straight when the car started to make a strange hissing sound. That was new. It was an '87 Pinto, only 5 years old, but we could tell already it was a complete lemon. I knew it didn't really have the legs for a drive like this, but we didn't have much of a choice. Trish and I had crossed the state border a while back without much ceremony. Nebraska into South Dakota doesn't offer a whole lot in the way of interesting road trip stories. We'd passed through Pine Ridge, and were back on a strip of highway with little to nothing to look at. It was all just fields and sky, and more of the same road disappearing ahead of us. I thought about turning back. Maybe there was a shop in that last town, but everything seemed fine. It was just that hissing sound. Trish was asleep in the passenger seat. She had taken the graveyard shift earlier in the drive. I thought about waking her, but decided to let her rest. I didn't have the map out, but I knew we were heading straight north, as the crow flies, for the foreseeable future. The sun was already starting to set. 8 hours had felt like a blink. But as I looked out over all that nothing on either side of the road, I started to feel uneasy. Uneasy that we were going to break down in the middle of nowhere, with no cell service, and no payphone for miles in either direction. Then the car started to cough black smoke. Well, that settled it. I pulled off onto the shoulder of the road. We were likely 30 or 40 miles from the nearest one-horse town. Trish woke to the sound of gravel and the smell of something burning. She was just as worried as I was, though we both tried our best to hide it. I popped the hood and stared into the mess inside. It was bad. A wall of smoke hit me in the face immediately. I didn't know anything about cars then. Honestly, I still don't. Trish didn't either. But even we knew this wasn't something we were going to fix on the side of the road. That meant walking. The day had been brutally hot. I knew that much because the AC never seemed to work in that car. But the sun was nearly gone now, and the air was cooling down fast. Walking in the dark seemed like our best option. We checked the map, but that only made things worse. We were stuck somewhere between two towns. What either of them could offer was anyone's guess. We didn't remember seeing a mechanic in the last one, not even a gas station. So we decided to head north. We had been walking along the road for maybe an hour, when Trish pointed ahead. Lights. At first I thought it was a town, but it wasn't. It wasn't a little Shell station either. From a distance, it almost looked like a Walmart. Some kind of massive department store dropped out in the middle of the plains. The lights gave it the strange appearance of a carnival. It was all red, yellow, and blue. They were strung in long arcs across the building, glowing against the darkness. We continued walking toward it, trying to get a better look. After another couple of miles, we finally reached it. It was a gas station, but not like any gas station I had ever seen. It reminded me a little of those giant travel stops you hear about, places like Buc-ee's. There had to be over 100 gas pumps, all of them perfectly clean, standing beneath a massive concrete canopy. The storefront behind them was enormous. Floor-to-ceiling glass windows lit up with neon signs, advertising cigarettes, beer, fresh food, and ATMs. The strangest part was how empty it was. I guess it made sense. It was close to midnight, and we hadn't seen a single car on the highway during the entire walk. Still, something about that place made my skin crawl. When something is that clean, that polished, it starts to feel wrong. The station looked like an eyesore in the endless darkness around it. It didn't belong there at all. One thing that was especially strange was the lack of branding. There was no signage anywhere claiming the store's name. As far as we could tell, it didn't even have one. We tried the front door, half expecting the place to be closed despite the multiple 24-hour signs hanging in the windows. The door opened with the jingle of a bell. We stepped inside, and that's when it really began to feel like we'd wandered into the Twilight Zone. The place was laid out more like a massive grocery store than a gas station. There were aisles upon aisles of food in bright, colorful bags. At first glance, they almost looked like brands we recognized: chips, candy, and cereal. But when you looked closer, something wasn't quite right. There were no labels, no logos. Just bright bags with bright designs. The entire store gleamed with an unnatural cleanliness. The floors shined like glass. The shelves looked freshly polished. Even the air felt sterile. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed softly, filling the silence with a faint electric buzz. Another thing that struck me was how tall the shelves were. They towered over us, much higher than anything I'd seen in a grocery store. If someone wanted something from the top shelf, they'd need a ladder to reach it. Still, strange as it was, none of that really mattered to us. We needed a payphone. We had to call a mechanic and figure out what to do about the car. So we stood there at the front of the store for a while, pacing slowly near the registers. But there was no one there. No customers, like I said, but no cashiers either. No workers. The place was completely dead. Yet it gave off the impression that it had just opened. Triangular flags were hung in wide arcs down from the ceiling, as if a celebration were about to begin. But nobody was here. Trish called out hello to nobody in particular. Her voice echoed through the large building, bouncing off the polished floors and high shelves. We listened for a moment, expecting someone to answer, but we didn't hear anything. She shrugged at me, and we began looking around for a payphone. The aisles were long. I had the strange feeling that you could get lost in a place like this. Not the sort of lost where you wander around for a few minutes before finding the exit again, but the kind where you might never find your way back out at all. That's why I decided to stay close to the entrance. I know it sounds irrational, but there was already so much about this place that didn't seem right. Its location, and how large it was, how clean it was. The whole place had an uncanny quality to it. We were about to leave the store and check around the back of the building for a payphone when the PA system suddenly cracked to life. The loud burst of feedback made both of us jump. We waited for someone to say something ordinary, Something like clean up on aisle 2 or attention shoppers. Instead, there was only silence. Then I heard something that made me stiffen. It was the low sound of breathing. Almost like someone with asthma trying to pull air into their lungs. It was slow and strained, but it seemed far away, as if whoever was making the sound was standing somewhere deep in the back of the building. Trish looked at me. Neither of us said anything. We're not idiots. We headed straight for the door. Whoever worked here was either pulling some kind of joke on us, or was a certified lunatic, and we weren't interested in finding out which. Then the lights shut off. At the same moment, we heard the doors lock. An automated jingle played through the darkness, followed by the cheerful voice of a woman over the speakers. The store is now closing. We tried the doors, but they wouldn't budge. We started shouting for someone to let us out, calling into the empty store, and hoping someone would answer. But once again, no one did. We stood there for a while, tense and unsure of what to do. It had already been a day from hell, and I could feel my temper starting to slip. I was ready to go off on the first person who showed their face. Then I saw something move down the dark aisle in front of me. A figure passed between the shelves. It looked like someone pushing a mop. I shouted and ran after them. Trish called for me in protest, but followed close behind. When I reached the spot where the man had been, my foot slipped out from under me, and I slammed hard into the shelf beside the aisle. When I looked down at the floor, I saw what I had slipped on. There was something there that smelled sour. It looked like curdled milk. A trail that stretched across the otherwise flawless floor, leading in the direction the janitor or store employee had been moving. Whoever it was had been leaving a mess behind him as he went. Trish asked if I was okay, but I hurried her along. We needed to find the man. We followed the foul-smelling skid marks around the bend and into the next aisle. The trail didn't disappear, but it began to thin out, fading slowly as if the source of it had begun to run dry. Then the fear I had felt earlier stopped being irrational. We were standing in the middle of an intersection of aisles. They stretched away in every direction, farther than we could see. It didn't make any logical sense. We couldn't have ran that far. It was as if the store had grown around us. I noticed a row of freezers filled with frozen food. A pale fog was spilling out of them and drifting slowly along the floor of the aisle. At first, it seemed like nothing more than freezer mist, but it was spreading farther than it should have, growing thicker the longer we stood there. Soon, it became difficult to see. Trish finally said what we both were thinking. There's something wrong with this place. I don't know if paranormal is the right word for it, but we both had the same feeling. We had somehow ended up in a place that didn't belong to our world. The proportions were wrong. Even the air felt wrong, thick and sterile, in a way that made it hard to breathe normally. It almost felt like we were hallucinating. We tried to find our way back to the entrance, but the farther we walked, the more lost we seemed to become in the labyrinth of aisles. It didn't seem possible. None of it felt like it could truly be real. Our feet were already sore beyond belief from the miles we had walked from the car. It had been a miserable day that somehow kept finding ways to get worse. We passed shelves filled with bags of what I could only assume were chips. The bags were swollen with air, stretched tight like balloons that might burst if they were handled too roughly. Trish thought we should eat something. What are they going to do? She said. Something about the idea felt wrong to me. Like whatever this place was, the food here was not real, not something that could truly be consumed. By then, the freezer mist had spread all around us, gathering thick at our ankles. We were nowhere near the frozen food section anymore, but the fog had taken over the entire store. It clung to the floor like a low, pale cloud. We couldn't even see our own shoes. Trish had picked up one of the bags and was turning it over in her hands, looking for anything printed on it. There was nothing. Just a bright red bag, covered in yellow swirls, bloated and shining under the blue fluorescent light. Then she screamed and dropped it. The bag struck the floor with a sharp popping sound, and she screamed again. I ran over to her and asked what happened. There was something moving inside it, she said. At first, I thought she was losing it, the same way I probably was. But then I saw the fog shift along the floor. It moved in quick ripples, as if something beneath it was slithering away down the aisle. Neither of us said anything. We simply stood there for a moment, trying to understand what we had just seen. Trish began to cry quietly. She wanted to leave. So did I. So we started walking in the opposite direction of whatever that thing was. We were no longer interested in finding a store attendant. We just wanted to get out. We moved slowly down the aisle, hoping we could somehow stumble across an exit. At some point, the overhead speaker crackled to life again. We both froze, waiting for something terrible to come through the system, something like a blood-curdling scream. Instead, it was just the breathing again. It somehow sounded closer than it had before. We began to pick up the pace, heading in no clear direction. It may have just been my mind playing tricks on me, but it felt like the aisles were getting tighter. The shelves seemed to be closing in on us. They still stretched endlessly ahead, but the space between them felt narrower now, and it made my chest tighten with claustrophobia. I don't know exactly when it started, but Trish and I had begun running, faster and faster. We were looking for an end to the aisles, for anything that resembled a way out. That was when I looked behind me. The janitor, the man with the mop, whatever he was. He stood far down the aisle, his silhouette outlined by the glow of freezer lights and the thick fog pooling behind him. For a moment, I almost slowed down, thinking I might call out to him. Then I looked at the floor. From his direction, dozens of thin grooves were slicing through the fog behind us. Whatever they were moving, fast. I shouted for Trish to run. She screamed, though she hadn't looked back and didn't know exactly what she was running from. Ahead of us, through the fog, we saw the end of the aisle, the cash registers, the checkout area. We ran as fast as we could until we reached the automatic doors. I was fully prepared to throw my weight into them, to smash through the glass if I had to. But just before I hit them, the doors slid open. Trish and I tumbled onto the pavement outside. The doors closed quickly behind us. None of the fog, or those things, escaped the store. The gas pump sat idle beneath the canopy. The neon signs still buzzed faintly in the windows. The building was dark again, silent, as if nothing had ever happened inside. We didn't say a word. We simply started walking back toward the car. It was approaching first light when a pickup truck finally stopped for us on the side of the road. We were 50 miles from the nearest town. It was probably 10 years ago when it happened. Nobody believes me. I don't blame them. So I guess I'll just write it down and maybe, hopefully, one day someone will read this and give me the benefit of the doubt. I used to be a photographer, technically a wedding photographer, but I always had higher aspirations. Some weeks, when I didn't have work, I'd drive around looking for interesting scenes to photograph. I didn't want to take yet another photo of a national park or a famous landmark. I wanted to find something that would stand out, something that might rattle a few cages. Maybe there would be some deeper meaning in it, but that was for viewers or art critics to interpret. Up until then, I hadn't found much, just occasional oddities. A gift shop with an old doll in the window missing one eye. A horse with a permanently shocked expression on its face. a stray dog wandering beneath a solar eclipse. None of those things really meant anything. They were just moments I happened to stumble across, but I found them interesting all the same. Anyway, like I was saying, it wasn't until around 10 years ago that I finally stumbled upon something different. I was driving through Utah. I had just finished taking a handful of depressing but emotionally evocative photos on some Indian reservation land when I came across something in the desert. The highway was empty, just a road sign wobbling slightly in the wind. I pulled over. I remember thinking to myself, now this is an art exhibit. There were probably a dozen doors standing upright across the sun-cracked ground. None of the doors were connected to anything. There were no walls or buildings. It was just random doors, standing upright in the desert. They stood alone, spaced out across the cracked earth, in a pattern that didn't seem deliberate at all. It wasn't a straight line or a circle, just a scattering of maybe a dozen doors, as if someone had walked through the desert planting them at random. Each one stood perfectly vertical. From the road, they looked almost like gravestones, but as I got closer, I realized what they were. Some were tall and some narrow. Each one was completely different from the next. They stood there in their varying colors and designs like portals to other worlds. I started taking photos immediately, though part of me knew my photographs wouldn't really mean anything if this was just some art installation that had already been widely documented. Still, I wanted my own photos, even as personal mementos of the strange display. All of the doors looked old and weathered with age, but each had its own character. One looked industrial, made out of metal. Another was painted pink with floral designs, almost like it belonged in a dollhouse. Another was green and flat-paneled. One had a heavy golden knocker mounted to the front. I approached them slowly, snapping photos all the while. Every so often I would turn around, expecting to see other tourists or road trippers stopping to take pictures, but nobody was there. The road was still empty. It was all very strange. A light breeze drifted through the air, but the doors didn't move at all. They were secured to the ground somehow, planted firmly in the desert soil. Curiosity got the better of me, and there didn't appear to be any signage or rules to the exhibit. I assumed it was interactive. I went over to one of the doors and placed my hand on the handle. It was locked. I tried another one. Same thing. Weird. I ended up trying a handful of them before I heard the familiar click of one that was willing to open. The handle turned easily and the door swung outward. On the other side was nothing. Just the desert. Maybe that was the point, some kind of metaphor. Then I stepped through the doorway, immersing myself in the weirdness of it all. The desert looked exactly the same on the other side. Same cracked earth, same empty sky. Though, for a moment I felt something strange. The same feeling you get stepping off a roller coaster, like my equilibrium was all thrown off. I looked around. The doors were all still there. Everything looked exactly as it had before, but the wind had picked up. And something even stranger. The doors that had been locked before were now swinging gently in the breeze, slowly opening and closing, one after another, as if they had all unlocked at once, or as if they were inviting me to step through. I nearly walked through another one before I noticed something that made my heart lurch. My car wasn't there anymore. The road was gone too, the sign with it. I turned, assuming I had simply lost my bearings. But the more I looked around, the more uncertain I became of where I was standing at all, and the more the realization set in that something had happened. Panic began settling in. The wind picked up quickly and suddenly, as if matching the energy of my distress. I tried stepping back through the door I had come from. Nothing changed. The road was still gone. My car too. All around me was just the same desert, stretching in every direction, flat and endless beneath the sun. It was a one-way door. That realization settled in slowly, like a cold weight. I stood there staring through the doorway, the one I had just stepped through, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Or rather, what I wasn't seeing. Deep down, I knew it couldn't be real. None of it could. It was insane. I shut my eyes and forced myself to breathe slowly, counting backwards in my head. It's a little trick I taught myself years ago, when panic starts creeping in. A way to ground myself when my mind starts running away from me. 10, 9, 8. But well before I reached 1, I heard something. A high-pitched laughter. The small, careless sound a child makes while hiding during a game. The sound cut clean through the wind. I remember I hoped I was back. I could see it in my mind's eye. A minivan pulling up on the highway, parked behind my car. A traveling family coming over to look at the strange attraction on the side of the road. But the sound was off. It was close, and echoed as if it were far away. Every instinct inside me told me to keep my eyes closed, to just keep breathing, and pretend none of this was happening. But of course, I looked anyway. It was a girl. Her head was sticking out from the pink door, the ones painted with the little floral patterns, the dollhouse. At first glance, she looked completely normal, just a child peeking around the edge of a door, curious about the stranger standing in the desert. But her body disappeared behind the doorframe. Then I noticed her teeth. They were thin and pointed, not quite fangs, more like needles. And her eyes were completely black, just empty, staring straight at me. I think I screamed. I stumbled backward without thinking and slammed hard into the doorframe behind me, the door I had stepped through earlier. My hands fumbled desperately for the handle until I found it. I yanked it open and stepped through without even looking. The child was gone. But my car wasn't there either. There was no logic to any of this anymore. I spun around and slammed the door shut behind me, gripping the handle again with both hands. I remember mumbling to myself under my breath. Maybe a prayer. It came out more like panicked begging. I opened the door again and stepped through, this time with my eyes squeezed tightly shut. For a second, I just stood there, too afraid to look. Then I cracked one eye open. There was my car, parked on the shoulder of the road, exactly where I'd left it. The doors stood out in the desert the way they had before, quiet and still. But to my relief, all of them were now closed. I let out a long breath I didn't realize I had been holding, though the world still felt slightly off. My arms and neck were tingling. My head felt heavy, like I just had a sudden change in elevation. My understanding of reality had been shattered in just a few minutes. Either that, or I just had my first manic episode, my first bat with a lifetime of schizophrenia. I walked slowly back to the car. For a moment I panicked when I couldn't find my keys, convinced I had left them behind in that other place. But they were simply in my back pocket. I sat in the driver's seat for a long time before starting the engine, staring out at those doors and listening carefully for that laugh. Part of me wanted to go back, to check each one, to make sure they were locked, because I still don't truly understand what was on the other side. I bought a house in Wyoming. Everyone said I was crazy, but I truly believed doomsday was right around the corner. I wasn't going to be the sucker caught in the city the day Armageddon finally arrived. So I bought a ranch house. It was a fixer-upper, sure, but I'm handy enough to deal with the electric, the plumbing, and basic carpentry. At first, I felt good about the whole thing. The land was wide open. The sky seemed endless. It was the kind of place you could survive anything. Off the grid. The thing I wasn't prepared for was the isolation. I've always been a loner. I never had many friends, and that never really bothered me. But I didn't realize how much I relied on other people until I found myself somewhere where there was no sound. There was no wind, no crickets, nothing. The quiet can be deafening. I'd been living on the ranch for a few weeks when I started noticing something strange. At first, I thought it was just my imagination. You would think that after a while, you'd get used to that kind of silence. You'd acclimate, but it was getting worse. The quiet wasn't just quiet. Somehow, it was becoming quieter. It felt like a lack of sound beyond silence itself. Eventually, I started hearing things I shouldn't have been able to hear at all. The blood pumping in my ears, the tiny movements inside my own body. It got so bad, at times it even felt like I could hear the bacteria crawling across my skin. And the house didn't help. Old ranch houses usually have character. You expect them to groan a little. The floorboards creaking when you walk across them, or the old pipes rattling when the water runs. The walls shift on windy nights. But this house had none of that. It didn't make a sound. Not once. You could walk from one end of the house to the other and never hear a single board complain under your weight. The doors didn't groan when you opened them. The cabinets didn't squeak on their hinges. Even the stairs, old wooden stairs that should have popped and cracked with every step, made no sound at all. Everything worked perfectly. The plumbing ran clean. The lights flicked on instantly. The furnace kicked on exactly when it should have. But the house itself was silent. Sometimes I would stand in the hallway in the middle of the night and just listen, expecting to hear something. Night noises, or just the settling of the frame. Maybe a pipe expanding somewhere behind the walls. But there was never anything. Just that same terrible quiet, pressing in from every direction. The longer I stayed there, the more I started to feel like the house was swallowing every sound. I think that's around the time I truly started to lose it. Ask someone else and they'll tell you I was stir crazy long before that. But they didn't live in that house like I did. I still didn't have cable, no satellite either. So I started leaving the television on with nothing but static playing. Just the soft, endless buzz filling the room. Anything but nothing. At first it helped. The sound gave the house some life. But as the weeks passed, I began to notice something that terrified me. The static was getting quieter. Not suddenly, not in any way I could measure, but slowly, almost imperceptibly, it seemed to fade out, like it was being taken over by the silence around it. I tried other things too. I would turn the shower on and let the water run so I could hear it. I would flip the furnace on and off, waiting for the click and hum of the system kicking in. Sometimes I would stand in the kitchen and run the sink just to hear the water rushing through the pipes. Anything to keep some kind of sound in my ears. But every time, the same thing would happen. The sound would slowly fade into the background until it felt like it had become part of the silence too. By the end of it, I was banging on pots and pans in the middle of the night just to hear something echo through the house. That's when I realized I was truly going mad. But I refused to leave. I wasn't going back to the city. Not back to crowds of people, pretending the world wasn't about to end. It wasn't about pride. or anyone saying I told you so. I just wanted to know that when everything finally fell apart, I would be able to survive on my own. I needed to know I could make it out there. But the deeper that silence crept into the house, the more I realized I wouldn't. I tried everything: meditating, medication, just lying there and breathing slowly, forcing myself to endure it. And that's when it happened. I was lying in bed one night, breathing slowly in the dark, when I realized something that made my stomach drop. I could no longer hear my own breathing. I screamed, but I didn't hear a sound. After that, I moved back to the city, back to the noise and the people. Let them say whatever they want about me. Because if the end of the world comes tomorrow, I'd rather face it surrounded by the sounds of screaming and fire and chaos. Anything is better than silence. I lived in Maine for a few years. I'd gotten tired of Boston before that. Tired of the traffic, the noise, the way people carried themselves, like you were already in their way before you even spoke. For a while, I told myself everyone out there was a jerk. Looking back now, I'm not so sure. It might have just been me. Either way, I needed to get out, so I went north. Kept going until the roads thinned out, then disappeared altogether. I ended up building a cabin in the North Maine woods. It was real remote. I wasn't completely cut off. There was a bar and a little grocery spot a couple miles out. Took a hike to get there, but it was something. A reminder that other people existed. I didn't go often. Most people out there kept to themselves. That's just how it is. Some are quiet by nature. Some are out hunting more than their home. And then there are the ones you don't ask about. The ones who came out there to simply stop being found. I never asked which kind anyone was. I figured they were doing me the same courtesy. I always stayed strapped, not because of the bears. You learn pretty quick that it's not the animals you need to worry about. It's the people. I kept a routine. Had to. Days blur together out there if you let them. They start to feel less like days, and more like one long stretch of time you can't quite measure. Saturdays were for cleaning, keeping the place from falling into some slow creeping kind of decay. Wednesdays and Fridays I'd go hunting, and then Tuesdays and Thursdays I'd work on taxidermy. That part surprised people when it came up, but it was steady work. Better than steady, actually. There's a market for it, bigger than you'd think. People like to hang something on their wall that proves a story, even if it's not their own. I didn't judge. Those animals kept me fed, paid for what I needed, gave me something to do with my hands on off days. I got plenty of requests, but what I worked on mostly came down to the season. A steady stream of whitetails. Every now and then, if someone drew a tag, a moose. Once in a while, a black bear. The smaller ones were always trickier, birds especially. There's a balance to it. Fire your shot too far and you'll wound it. Too close and you'll ruin it. You're not just hunting at that point. You're thinking about the mount before you ever pull the trigger, where the shot lands, and what it's going to look like. I had a dog, Rover. He was a good retriever. Too good, maybe. 8 years of bringing birds back to hand, and he got used to doing it his way. Never quite got heel through his head. He'd come bounding back like he'd done something heroic. Feathers all out of place, proud as anything. Cost me more than a few clean specimens over the years. Still, he was better company than most people. Anyway, all of this to say, one day Rover brought me something I couldn't explain. He came tearing back through the brush like he always did, chest out and tail wagging, proud of himself. For a second, I figured he'd flush the bird and double back on me. But when he got closer, I could tell right away it wasn't the waterfowl I'd dropped. He was carrying something else. Something I hadn't shot. At At first glance, I thought it was a fawn. It was small, light enough for him to carry without struggling, legs tucked in the way they do when something's been picked up clean. But the longer I looked at it, the less sense it made. The legs were too thin, not delicate, just incorrect, like they bent in places they shouldn't. The hooves were split, but uneven, like they hadn't decided what they were supposed to be yet. And the head, I remember thinking the head looked unfinished. It wasn't damaged, not partially eaten. It just wasn't right. The face was too narrow, and the eyes were set too far forward. Its mouth hung open slightly, and I could see teeth where there shouldn't have been any yet. Rover dropped it at my feet like he always did. He sat down, waiting. I didn't touch it right away. I just stood there looking at it, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. I was turning it over in my head, the same way I would any animal that came across my table. That's what it was, I told myself. An animal. Just not a healthy one. You see enough out there, and you start to understand things don't always come out right. Birth defects, parasites, things that don't survive more than a few hours, maybe a day if they're lucky. Most never make it far from where they're dropped. That's what I figured it was. Something that hadn't made it. The woods take care of those things quick. A mother will abandon it. Sometimes she has to. Sometimes she knows before anything else does. I crouched down after a while and took a closer look. Up close, it was easier to pretend. The hide, if that's what it was, had the same color as a deer's. Soft and mottled brown. It even had the faint white spotting along the back, like a fawn would. But the proportions were off. They didn't line up the way they should. I'd worked on enough deer to know that without thinking. Still, you can convince yourself of a lot if you want to. It might have been something in the water, or in the soil. People talk about that sometimes. Runoff and chemicals, things getting into places they shouldn't. Something like that made more sense than anything else. I reached out and pressed my fingers into its side. It was still warm. I'd never seen anything like it before. I think that alone made it worth something. At least I told myself that was the reason. It might be valuable. I wrapped it up in my coat and carried it back to the cabin. I laid it out on the workbench once we were inside. Under the overhead light, it almost looked normal again, if I didn't study it too closely. The color and size were right. It was only when you let your eyes settle that things started to slip. I stuck to my schedule. I told myself I'd take a better look in the morning. I washed up, fed Rover, and turned in early. At some point in the night, I woke up. I couldn't say what had done it. There wasn't any sudden noise or anything like that. Just the sense that I was no longer alone in the way I had been when I went to sleep. It took me a moment to place it, lying there in the dark and listening. Something was moving outside. Not far off, close enough that I could hear it in the gravel and the thin brush around the cabin. It wasn't heavy like a bear, and it didn't have that quick, careless rhythm of a deer cutting through. Whatever it was moved slowly, with a kind of patience that didn't sit right. I stayed in bed and listened for a while, expecting it to pass. It didn't. After a minute or two, Rover let out a low sound from the foot of the bed. Not a bark, not even a growl, just something quiet in his throat. I'd only heard him make that sound a handful of times. He didn't get up, didn't go to the door. He just stayed there where he was, eyes fixed on the dark like he was trying to see through the walls. The sound outside stopped. That part bothered me more than anything. I lay there for a while longer, listening for it to start again. When it didn't, I convinced myself it had moved on. Something passing through, nothing more. Eventually I got up. I told myself I was going to check the door, make sure it was latched. That was all. But when I stepped into the other room, I found myself looking past it. The thing on the workbench was no longer lying the way I'd left it. I stood there for some time before I went any closer, trying to remember if I'd set it down differently, trying to convince myself I had. But I knew that wasn't true. It had been on its side when I left it. Now it was facing the door. I crossed the room after a while and put a hand on it. It was cold. I turned it back on its side and left it there, more out of stubbornness than anything else. I shut the light off over the bench and went back to bed. Rover didn't follow. I called for him once, then again, thinking maybe he hadn't heard me. He stayed where he was in the other room. I could hear him shifting his weight on the floor, nails clicking faintly against the wood. He was anxious. I left the door open and lay back down, listening. Eventually, I went to sleep. When I woke up, Rover was still in the doorway. He was in the same spot as the night before, or close enough to it that I couldn't tell the difference. He was sitting upright, eyes moving between me and the other room, like he'd been doing it for a long time. I got up and stepped past him. The thing was exactly where I'd left it, on its side, head turned slightly toward the door, but no more than I'd expect from the way I'd set it down. There was no sign it had been moved. Outside, the fog hung low between the trees. It wasn't thick enough to hide everything, but it seemed to soften the landscape. It made the woods feel closer than they were. I stepped off the porch and looked around. At first, I didn't see anything, just the usual. Trees, brush, the narrow stretch of ground I kept clear around the cabin. Then I noticed the marks in the dirt. Tracks. Hooves by the look of them, split like a deer. But they weren't shaped right. The points were too long. They were too narrow. And they'd sunk deeper than they should have for something that size. They circled the cabin once, maybe twice. I followed them as far as I could before they disappeared into the brush. When I came back to the door, I saw the scratches, 3 of them, running down the wood just beside the handle. Not deep, but clean. They were fresh, like something was testing the door. Rover came up behind me and stopped short of the steps. He didn't come down into the yard. He just stood there, staring past me into the trees. Then he started to whine, sounds I'd never heard before. I followed his line of sight. There was a patch of brush about 20 yards out, a thicket covered in ferns and low growth. It was thick enough to hide anything small, maybe even something larger if it stayed low. The fog clung to it heavier there, gathered in a way that made it hard to see where one shape ended and another began. At first I thought I was just looking at shadows. Then something shifted. Not movement. It was too vertical and still. I kept my eyes on it, waiting for it to resolve into something I recognized. Then I realized I hadn't brought my gun out with me. I stood there another second, then turned quickly and went back inside. Rover followed me, relieved, but stayed close enough that I could feel him at the back of my legs as I moved. I looked again at the thing on the table. It was the same as before, wrong in all those ways I couldn't quite put words to. If it was something natural, it didn't belong with me. If it wasn't, then it definitely didn't. I left it there the rest of the day and didn't touch it again. I kept busy with other things, small jobs that didn't need much attention, anything to keep my hands moving and my mind off what I'd seen out in the trees. Every now and then I'd catch myself listening, not for a specific sound, more like I was expecting something to make itself known. That night I wrapped the thing up, just in a piece of canvas I'd kept for hauling things. I didn't bother with the bench light. I didn't want to look at it any more than I had to. Rover watched from across the room. He didn't come any closer. I carried it outside and set it down at the edge of the clearing, just before the brush started, in the same place I'd seen the tracks turn back into the woods. For a second, I stood there with it at my feet, not sure what I was waiting for. Nothing happened. The fog had settled in again with the night. I left it there and went back inside. I closed the door and latched it. Then I went around the cabin and pulled the curtains shut, one by one, leaving no gap anywhere. I didn't sleep. I laid in bed and stared into the dark, listening the way I had the night before. But this time there was no sound, not even the sense of something passing through. All was quiet outside. In the morning, the fog had lifted. The clearing looked like it always did. I stepped out and walked straight to where I'd left the thing the night before. But nothing was there. There was no body or blood or signs of struggle, only the ground, pressed slightly where it had been, and the tracks, clearer now in the light, leading in from the woods and back out again. I didn't follow them. I went back inside, packed what I could carry, and left that place before the sun had climbed much higher. I didn't go back.